Why is technology playing such a decisive role in this war? Who is ahead in technological innovation, Ukraine or Russia? How are drones reshaping the battlefield, and how might they also transform technologies of peace? And why must Europe step up its technological cooperation with Ukraine? You're listening to the Explaining Ukraine podcast. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld, and president of PAN Ukraine. My guest today is Glib Voloskyi, analyst at the Initiative Center of Come Back Alive, Povernys, zhyvym, one of Ukraine's most prominent charitable foundations supporting the military and veterans since 2014. Explaining Ukraine is produced by UkraineWorld, an English-language media project about Ukraine run by Internews Ukraine. This episode is also made in partnership with Politeia, a Ukrainian NGO focusing on preparing a new generation of change makers in Ukraine. Before we begin, a quick reminder, you can support our work on Patreon. Your contributions are essential. We rely heavily on crowdfunding. You can also help fund our volunteer trips to frontline areas in Ukraine, where we support both civilians and soldiers. Donations are welcome via PayPal. You'll find all the relevant links in the episode description. So let's begin. Glib Voloskyi, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for agreeing to talk. So we decided to talk about many different issues on this conversation. But let me first start with the strategic questions. What do you think is the Russian strategy in this war? Why I'm asking this question? Because in the debates, in the discussions about this war, in the West or other regions of the world, there is very often an idea that, okay, if Russia grabs some territory, if we get a territory swap, territory exchange, or whatever, Russia will stop, which is, of course, obvious for Ukrainians that this is not going to happen. What do you think?
Well, talking about the strategy, I think it's very important not to fall a prey to a common but a flawed assumption about this very linear, coherent, and stable strategy that exists from the beginning until the end of the conflict. In the popular media, it's always go alongside with this idea of a mastermind who calculates all the steps and foresee all his adversary movements. But even more academic studies sometimes suffer from this problem, partly because of the hindsight bias, partly because the storytelling, this narrative form of storytelling, they create overly straightforward and overly logical sequence of events than it was in reality. So with this caveat in mind, I think it's more appropriate to talk about Russian strategies rather than the Russian strategy, about the way how the initial ideas that the Russia had about war were undermined, how they adapted, and how their strategy evolved in the process. Initially, Russia didn't plan this war as a conventional attritional operation. When they call it special military operation, it's only partly a euphemism designed to conceal the illegal character of their actions. But partly it's also a signal of their strategy, of what the character of the operation that they was going to conduct. Because initially in this operation, the primary role was played not by military, but by special forces, by sabotage and reconnaissance group that were operating in Kyiv, by assassination squads that were supposed to behead the Ukrainian government. Military was playing rather deterrence and psychological role. They was not supposed to engage in the fighting that much. But as we now know, Russia miscalculated. The Ukrainian military turned out to be much more combat ready than the Russian military planners anticipated. Assassination squads failed and sabotage groups failed to establish control over the key industrial objects. And similarly, the airborne units that tried to occupy Hostomel airport and open the way for the Russian military to the Kyiv failed to do that. As the conflict dragged on, it also became apparently that the Russian logistics system was not prepared for any sort of the prolonged confrontation. So basically, their tanks ran out of fuel, soldiers went hungry, trying to looting the civilian property in search of food, and the ammunition shortage become very severe at some point. In April 2022, Russia decided to amend its strategy. They withdrew from Kyiv and concentrated their efforts in the Donetsk region in a hope to create this huge pincer movement going from Kharkiv and from Kherson toward Pavlograd in attempt to envelop the most combat-ready parts of the Ukrainian military concentrated in the Donetsk region. They increasingly shrink that initial envelopment, firstly from Horlivka to Izum, and then end up cutting up Ukrainian military from Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, forcing to retreat from this relatively large settlement, but ultimately failed to crush the Ukrainian military and conducting and occupying much less ground than they initially expected. Moreover, in the process, they exhausted their offensive potential. And Ukraine managed to exploit that when we conducted an operation in September, in autumn 2022, Kupiansk-Liman operation, they occupying a significant part of the Ukrainian territory, Balaklava, Izum.
Mostly Kharkiv region, right?
Yeah, mostly Kharkiv region. That's essentially a setback, relatively significant setback by the standards of this war. They prompted Russia to reconsider their strategy again. It was that point where they finally accepted that the war probably will be prolonged and it probably will be attritional. So that was the moment then when they announced the partial mobilization, when they invested heavily in the expansion of their defense industry, and when they started to fortify their position on the occupied parts of Ukraine. So essentially, in that period, three main pillars of the Russian strategy, which with some nuances and some changes exist until now. Firstly, they continue advance on the battlefield using their demographic resources and the overwhelming firepower to slowly green forward in a hope that at some point the Ukrainian military will be exhausted and their progress will quickly speed up. Secondly, they invest heavily in informational campaigns inside the Ukrainian military, but also conduct the combined air, drone and missiles attack on Ukrainian infrastructure in an attempt to undermine the morale of Ukraine's civilian population to keep fighting. And thirdly, but of course not least, they play on the diplomatic arena, trying to undermine the foreign support of the Ukrainian military. Most recently, they have particularly high expectations of the negotiation with the newly elected American president. Russia saw that as an opportunity to have a new Yalta, where they would split the Europe between the US and Russia, where Russia would gain a significant share of its sphere of influence. But the problem for Russia was that it was not plausible and not possible for the American president to portray the demand that Russia was making as a victory, as any sort of the acceptable deal. Essentially, even though the US initially indicated the readiness to make some concessions, the Russian goals was too much, because they were never limited to the territorial dimension. It's important to understand that their goals go as far as to set up the full control of Ukraine, not necessarily to occupy the Ukraine completely, but at least to set up the regime that is loyal to the Moscow. But their ambition, in fact, goes beyond Ukraine. And if you look at their position during this negotiation, and if you look at their claims and their demands on the beginning of this invasion, they essentially extend as far as the Eastern Europe. All the countries that joined the NATO after 1997, NATO was supposed to withdraw this country, essentially leaving this country vulnerable for any sort of the military pressure from Russia.
This is a problem that I face, and you probably face all the time. When this war is called Ukraine war, Ukrainian conflict, I just had an interview with the French television. It's still Ukrainian conflict. And, it's already much more than that, right? It's a Russian-Ukrainian war. The warfare is also on Russian territory. Ukrainian forces make deep strikes. But also I agree with you that Russian ideas go much, much farther. What is those ideas? What is this strategy? If I tell you that this is an attempt to come back to the post-World War II situation, or maybe with a slightly change, because in the post-World War II, the world was kind of divided between the two blocks. Now Russia probably wants three blocks: China, Russia, Eurasia, as they call it, and, America. Europe does not exist really, because Russia wants part of Europe to be incorporated in its new empire. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Their idea is to renew the Soviet Empire or the Russian Empire, not in the sense of ideology, not in the sense of the centralized economic planning, of course, but in the sense of being the great power, of being the state that alongside other great powers decide the future and the fate of the small states on the international arena.
How is Ukraine defending? Because my impression is, I will do very simplistically, and correct me if I'm wrong. So initially we had much less resources than Russia, and the Western weapons, of course, started arriving, but they were arriving with a certain delay, of course. And as you said, it's very interesting that all these columns of Russian military were not supposed to do the fighting. They were probably giving the psychological impact, but Ukrainians were, fighting them and very successfully. But then Ukrainians, understanding that we are lagging behind artillery, for example, or any other forms of distant fighting, Ukrainians started using the drones as this strategy. And now it seems that the war is going in this direction. And we have a special episode about drones. But it seems that in this situation, Ukrainians failed to speed up it very, very fast and to kind of accelerate it and to have a clear technological advantage over the Russians, because Russians took over many of the Ukrainian technologies and now it's difficult to say who is ahead. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. The current cycle of innovation and adaptation to this innovation is fierce, and there is no any significant advantage that either side have. Russia had the benefit of pioneer in so-called fiber optic drones. That's essentially a drone that use fiber optic to communicate with the operator, and which that resistance to electronic warfare, one of the primary methods of protecting against drones in this war.
So to our listeners, fiber optic drones means that the drone has a cable.
Yeah,
it's very thin, but it's very long. It can last for dozens of kilometers, and therefore it's impossible to down it with radio electronic warfare, with jamming this drone.
Essentially, Russia heavily invested in that technology, and it played a large impact during the offense in the Kursk Oblast, because they managed to use the optic fiber drone to severe land communication lines that goes from Ukrainian Sumy to the Ukrainian group that operate in Sumy, and under the risk of the suffering significant shortage of ammunition, of supplies, and the risk of not being able to evacuate the wounded soldiers, Ukrainian military had to slowly retreat. Now they try to use that strategy again, essentially harassing the Ukrainian land communication line now in Donetsk region, but also in Sumy. But Ukraine is catching up on the fiber optic drones. And from the Ukrainian side, we have more or less clear advantage in drone interceptors technologies. That's essentially drones that are designed to intercept other drones. Those are currently used to intercept larger reconnaissance drones, heavy bombers, and increasingly Shahed drones. So those large kamikaze drones that Russia used to attack Ukraine every night. But if this technology evolve enough to stop intercept first-person view drones, that's one of the primary type of drone that's currently used on the battlefield, that might be a really revolutionary change that have a significant impact on the battlefield.
What do you expect? I remember that when I came to the front line like last summer and people started talking about fiber optic drones, it was like, wow, there were some, very several examples of it. Now it's just massive. So it seems that every several months there is some drastic change in the technology that other sides needs to adapt. What do you expect in the near future?
One of the technology, apart from the drone interceptors, that increasingly is being deployed is the unmanned land vehicles. So there's different types of robotic systems that used to supply troops on the front line, for example, under conditions when both sides try to undermine the communication line by attacking it with drones. You can use other drones to supply your troops. They also increasingly used to evacuate wounded soldiers from the most dangerous condition without the risking life of evacuation teams. And those drones become more and more sophisticated and more widely used. There are also a lot of experiments of setting different armament systems on those drones, heavy machine guns, grenade launchers, automatic turrets to intercept drones. So that's something that potentially might have a large impact and might be another big technological development on the battlefield.
So it's all about robotics. It's all about distant management. It's all about replacing people with machines. It's all very interesting and frankly very frightening as well, but it will also probably influence the civilian technology afterwards. What about artificial intelligence? Everybody talks about it. Is it applied on the front line right now?
It is increasingly used to locate targets because under such circumstances, when we have so many reconnaissance drones, they collect huge amount of data. And it's often impossible for human beings or the human analyst to process it all. So the artificial intelligence help to identify potentially interesting targets. So the human analyst can then review it and decide whether you should engage it or not, or whether it's an indicator that Russia preparing an offensive operation there or something like that. It's also heavily used to analyze social media because a lot of the soldiers, both from Ukrainian and Russian side, publish a lot of information that they shouldn't publish. For example, where pictures of them in the trenches or pictures of the military vehicles that they operate in their brigade. So that's often allowed to identify where the group is, what armament it has, how many people there, potentially find some problems. And by processing huge amount of this data from social media, a lot of different pieces of puzzles emerge that can then fused be in a larger strategic and operational and tactical picture.
But when I look at the situation, for example, I understand one drawback that Ukrainians have is that there are lots of things are dependent on Chinese technology. And they're going to Ukraine through many different ways, almost very, clandestine ways. But in this sense, if you look like strategically, then it seems that Russia has much more advantage over Ukraine because it is much, much closer to China. What do you say about this? Well, maybe I'm wrong about this.
There are such concern about the producers in Ukraine, and some of them try to produce indigenous components for the drone production. But I do think that risk may be somewhat overestimated because the same way that Russia now managed to bypass all the sanctions that we impose them, it is possible to bypass all the restrictions that the Chinese companies attempt to impose on Ukraine, on Europe, on the US. Again, there's third-person companies, different layers that are used to produce all those components and equipment. There is really no way to fight against them unless you're ready to completely stop your export.
But what about the West? Because what I'm saying to Europeans is, look, guys, you're losing the technological, technological race to both Americans and China. And if you don't want to help Ukraine out of, empathy and humanism, for which Europeans are famous, but if you want to help Ukraine just for pragmatic reasons, think about this, because the war, cynically enough, it also kind of a laboratory of a new technology. So we see the technology of drones, of robotics, of artificial intelligence. What would you say?
Ukraine has a huge impact on the way that war will be fought in next decade, because there are a lot of lessons learned from this, and a lot of Western countries and a lot of Western producers actually operate in Ukraine and trying to collect as much information as they can. A lot of Western weapon that is used in Ukraine actually being actively experimented with and actually provided feedback on. So helping the Western defense producers to improve and to adapt their technologies to the tactical reality on the battleground. But also that's happening on the other side, of course, because there are a lot of Russian officers who collect the lessons learned. There are a lot of Chinese officers who operate on the battlefield and also study how the war is waged. And now there is increasingly more analysts from North Korea who collect the information and who used it to reform the way North Korea fight and the way North Korean would approach to any military conflict they engage in. But importantly here probably is that the way Ukraine fight and the way Ukraine employ technology and the technology that Ukraine decide to use, they heavily depend on the nature of this conflict, on the balance of power, on the side that we fight, even on the culture. And it's not necessarily that West or US or UK or India or any other country would fight in exactly the same way that Ukraine fight. And that it's not exactly that all the technology that Ukraine use will be useful for Western countries or for the countries that consider the West to be an adversary. There's a huge debate now in Western military community whether we should take the lessons that we learn in Ukraine completely, whether we should, in fact, ignore them and stick to existing military traditions, or whether we should selectively take some of the insights and fuse them with our paradigm that we wage war.
Look, initially, Ukraine and Ukrainian message in 22-23 was give us weapons to the West. And there was a huge discussion about tanks. Now we see that tanks are probably useless on the battlefield, or at least they are not as important as in 2022. When Ukraine was preparing this counteroffensive in the south in 23, I remember people were talking, give us tanks, give us tanks. It was a complete failure for different reasons. But now I don't really see even the Russians that they attack with tanks. Maybe appearance of one tank is already in news. We read it in the news. So they are attacking with small groups, and drones are much more important because tanks are very vulnerable, especially in this steppe war in the south and in the east. So I think Ukrainian message to the world right now that probably you don't even have what we need, and you don't probably even have what you will need. So let's cooperate together and think about the future, what technologies in the future you will need and we will need now. Does this message work? Do we succeed in kind of embedding our partners' military-industrial complex into the tasks of this battlefield?
I actually been curious about that, about the tank role on the battlefield, and I also was skeptical about its role. But when you talk to the soldiers, they are far less inclined to believe that tanks are outdated. In fact, and the reason why Russia used tank much less than they used to now is rather have to do with the shrinking warehouses of
they just don't have it.
Yeah. They produce a marginal number of new tanks, in fact, up to 200 a year. And most of the tanks that they use during this war, it's refurbished tank from the old Soviet stock. So they just running out of it and they don't have the opportunity to use that. And here's in question, in fact, to what extent the war was revolutionized in Ukraine, whether we should completely again abandon the paradigm that we used before, or should we fuse it? And increasingly, the analyst community think that there will be much of a fusion. Tank, for example, might be useful, but they definitely will require a lot of adaptation. Maybe they should be much lighter, because you cannot now protect them by just laying additional layers of armor. Thanks to the increased precision of weapon and drones, for example, and your ability to hit specifically in the vulnerable parts, it usually gives you diminishing returns. And sometimes it's much more pragmatic to actually make your tank lighter and more maneuverable, so it quickly shoot at the position that you need to suppress and just leave the battlefield. Another thing is that probably will be useful is the automatic turrets, or system of active defense that used to intercept drones and which will radically increase the survivability of tanks. There is a huge debate now about the air forces, whether we will need a crewed aircraft or we'll need just drones, or maybe they will operate again in a pairs. And the approach that I see in the West is again rather overfusion than completely abandon of the military tradition. They now consider the most likely scenario is the use of the crewed aircraft as a command and control center, which operate a huge number of drone swarms that are sent forward to suppress all the threats for this aircraft, be it air defense system or the soldiers with man parts.
Yeah, two things I can imagine. The first is that tanks can fly, for example, and we are in the Star Wars movies when there is a huge armored thing in the air. Why not? And the second thing is that we have actually the kind of armies of drones in the air, and tanks are protected not with radio electronic warfare, but with interceptive drones. And in this way, there is this tanks become again very important because they are more protected. Yeah, everything is possible. What I'm saying is that things are changing very much. And my question is, do you think that, for example, our partners like NATO partners, Ukraine's NATO partners, meaning Europe, United States, Canada, or maybe other countries, are following this war in a way that they adapt their technologies to these trends?
They definitely follow and they definitely collect the lessons learned. They now increasingly intense cooperation between different institutions, both the public institutions and non-governmental organizations, to collect the insights and the lessons learned. But the problem is it's not necessarily mean the implementation of these lessons, again, even those that are relevant, because in the end, it's not only the fact and analysis that will decide whether some lessons should be implemented or should not. Military conservatism will play a huge role. Vested interest of military-industrial complex will have a dramatic role, and of course, organizational interest within the military. I guess that air forces will not be completely happy to see the increased importance of drones, and tank brigades will not be happy about the diminishing role of the tanks, even if not completely will be abandoned.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So it's like happened during the First World War, right? Suddenly you understand that people on horses are not efficient enough against the tanks. Okay, let's talk about Ukrainian military industry, because Russia invested a lot to destroy it from within. We know the history, how basically during Yanukovych time and previously, Ukraine was suiciding itself by basically annihilating what it had. But suddenly it revived. It revived already after the 2014, and now we see that Ukraine is producing a lot of drones. Ukraine is again producing rockets. But from what I hear is that there is a huge difference with Russia, because Russia is much more centralized, and in Russia there will be one technology which will be scaled up, and in Ukraine you will have thousands of enterprises, small enterprises that will produce, for example, drones for these particular brigades, and therefore Ukrainians are probably better at innovating, but Russians are better at scaling up. Is it true?
Yes, exactly. And part of the reason for that is the way how this technologies and how the way we produce them emerge. Because in case of Ukraine, especially if we talk about those new technologies like drones and recent implementation of mobile electronic warfare system, they emerge rather as a grassroots initiative than any top-down decision. It was soldiers who, suffering from the lack of firepower, experimented with the different way to compensate for the lack of the artillery munition. At first, they attached explosives to reconnaissance drones and used it as a bombers. They experimented then with the FPV drones, again, as attaching explosives to them to use them as a kamikaze. It is only later, when those technologies were taken by the private industry and become much more specialized, much more designed specifically for the military purpose rather than being handmade modification of civilian technology. And the state relatively recently stepped in to scale up their production really to the extent that the Russian doing that. That approach both has its benefit, as you mentioned, in fact, and advantages and disadvantages, because we have so many different brigades and units and local R&D groups and the different producers. We, on the one hand, produce a lot of innovations. On the other hand, we produce a lot of very tailored solutions for the specific tactical circumstances that this or that brigade need. But simultaneously, it, of course, has disadvantages. It's really hard to scale up the production when you have such a diverse market. And because none of the producers actually produce something at scale, the economic of scale doesn't work, so the production actually more expensive than it would be otherwise when we would invest in single technology or in selection of several technologies. That's where Russia has an advantage, but on the battlefield currently, they doesn't still have a significant numeric superiority in terms of the drones. I mean, numerically we are more or less in parity, And that's probably a good news that despite all the challenges that Ukrainian industry is experiencing, it still managed to keep up at least with the drone production, with the far more larger economy that Russia is.
And with robotics, with the land drones or water drones, it seems that Ukraine is ahead, or not?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the reason for that is the extensive use of Russian optic fiber drones, and again our need to adapt to these changing circumstances, and the fact that we are an underdog in this war and that we cannot wage war just with the numbers or just with the concentration of resources. It basically forces us to constantly adapt and to find new solutions. Doesn't have an opportunity to fight with the Russian fleet conventionally. We come up with the idea of the naval drones, and now doesn't have an opportunity to just send one logistic group or one evacuation group one after another, disregarding whether they die or not, because we have huge amount of demographic resources in the case of Russia. As we cannot do that, we have to again find new solutions to preserve the precious demographic resource that we have.
So it's interesting. Well, as always in life, weakness is another side of strength. So strength comes out of your weakness sometimes. Is there any Wunderwaffe, meaning that some, magical weapon that probably is changing dramatically the battlefield? Because from what I see for Ukrainians, it's very hard to combat against these fiber optic drones and very hard to combat against the gliding bombs, the so-called Kabe. Or we found a solution already.
There is no Wunderwaffe, and I don't expect there to be. There are some technology that can give you a window of opportunity and relatively short window of advantage when you can implement some sort of the operation or achieve some of the operational or even strategic objectives before an opponent find a way to counteract it. But generally, it's a combination of things, a combination of different technologies, and usually a combination of both technologies and the tactics, and the way these technologies and the tactics and the different units and the different capabilities that you have is synchronized. It is just like the evolution that happened between the First and the Second World War. It was not that much about the tanks and that much about aircraft per se, as about the specific way how they were combined together to achieve this effect of synergy that none of them have in isolation. So in terms of Ukraine, potential technology that might have a significant impact and might have create this window of opportunity is drone interceptors, if we manage to coordinate them with the other systems, essentially to suppress the Russian drones and to establish a sort of equivalent of air superiority with our attack drones, and then conduct a land advance. Using this fire superiority, occupying the beneficial position, and to use them to press forward. But that, of course, will depend to a large extent on the ability to have enough people to conduct an offensive operation, but also to operate drones, because those drones are not automatic, and the human is still in the center of the warfare, and the human's capabilities in the center of these efforts. So much depends on the extent the officers is trained and how they're able to synchronize these efforts. Much depends on how the pilots is trained and how effective they are in the use of the drones, be it the drone interceptors or the more combat drones. It is really a system of things, and the problem that we need to juggle with a lot of balls simultaneously.
And so it's a question of doctrine, right? How you put those things together. What is the role of infantry? Because I hear the two absolutely conflicting or opposing thoughts. The first thought is that the role of infantry will always be crucial, because in the end it's the individual soldier who steps up in a certain trench or enters a certain city. But on the other hand, I see increasingly that on the point zero, actually the positions are very often empty, because the gray zone, because of the drones, the gray zone increases, and basically it's very difficult, we know, to supply the point zero. the soldiers on really the contact line, because all the fields for 30-40 kilometers is covered by the drones. What is your opinion?
There are primarily three roles that the infantry is performing. Firstly is the control of the territory. If your infantry is not in the city, it doesn't matter how many drones of yours fly over it, it doesn't control this city. But then there is another second very critical role of the infantry is a shielding. And they essentially create this line between the advancing enemy forces and between your command and control systems, drone operators, evacuation squads, field hospitals, and all those critical infrastructure that need to be protected. Even if you have a really strong fire superiority and you can suppress all the advanced group that advanced further, and there is a still problem that they might try to use speed, as the Russians currently actually try to do with all those motorcycles and buggies to as quickly cross the kill zone as possible and just entering your rear, rating havoc there and destabilizing this part of the front line and your ability to wage a defensive operation. If there is an infantry that's sitting there, they able to pin down the advanced forces, to interrogate them in a fight, for them to be later destroyed with the fire. And the critical role, of course, of infantry, again, is assault, because you might weaken and suppress the enemy's position, but someone need to go there. Someone need to clean the remaining forces there and to ultimately establish control. We so far doesn't have any sufficient level of technologies to replace the human being and to implement and to use them for this role. Some of the robotic systems that currently gain much of the attention in social media, on different enterprises shows, they usually doesn't perform that well on the battlefield. Part of the problem is that they are not autonomous, and artificial intelligence is not advanced enough to make them like completely autonomous. And if you try to operate them from the distance, the connection is a problem, because if your connection with the army can be suppressed and can be severed, and that make your entire army incapable and not combat ready, that's a problem. But also maneuverability of this system is also a problem. We still haven't managed to design a system that can match flexibility of the human being on the battlefield, its ability to hide in different holes and to cross different terrain and to adapt to the changing circumstances. That's something that technology cannot match yet.
It's interesting how humanity invented artificial intelligence but still hasn't invented artificial bodies.
Yeah.
And it seems that the human body is probably a much more complex system than the human brain. I mean, well, it's all connected in the brain. I mean, human calculating mind, let's put it this way, because mind has a lot of other things than just calculating, or even language. Yeah, it's very, very interesting. So we are very far from these clone armies coming back to the Star Wars. What is your vision of let's say, how to put it? So, for example, we know that Russians are not capturing cities, but they are destroying cities. And we know that geopolitical demands to Ukraine get away from Zaporizhia, Kherson, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, because it's all ours. My argument always to the foreigners is that, look, Russians, it's very difficult in the current war to capture a big city. So if you spend a year to destroy Bakhmut, then how much time will you spend to capture/destroy Kherson again or Zaporizhia? It will take probably years, if not more. What is your take on this?
On the one hand, it's true. It's extremely difficult to occupy a city. And in fact, the only time the large city, like regional center, was occupied was Kherson on the onset of the invasion, when it basically was occupied without much of the fight because Ukraine was so destabilized and didn't have sufficient number of military forces to protect all its borders. But then the logic is not necessarily will be linear here, as one of the sides getting increasingly more exhausted another side might start to advance much more quicker than that, because we are not in maneuverable war, we are in a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, the land is a lagging indicator. Territorial changes can be very small, very slow, but then start to rapidly grow fast. And that's one of the things why we need really to support Ukraine as much as possible and in the quickest time frame, because as we attempt to postpone the issues, postpone the provision of the certain equipment, or postpone the certain necessary decisions, it varies the Ukrainian army, and that might be some point when the progress of the Russians will quickly speed up. So that's definitely a risk.
And here information plays a huge role, because what is in the minds of people? Because, for example, when I see all these geopolitical debates and Trump and Putin, etc., if we have a situation when a big part of Ukrainian citizens will perceive certain agreements as treachery, then there will be calamity inside, and then Ukraine will be defeated by itself inside, because some of the people will think that it is a good deal and others will think that it is a betrayal. And I think this is the major goal of the Russians, and has always been. Now, when you said rightly that there was a first strategy to conquer Ukraine very quickly, then there is a strategy of war of attrition. It also doesn't seem to work very well for Russians, but there is always this third strategy, how to weaken Ukraine from inside. Is that correct?
Essentially, those three pillars, they are mutually reinforcing, and they enter in this positive loop feedback, because as you advance on the battlefield, you can use it for your informational campaign, both inside Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, portraying that Ukraine fight is a lost cause and you don't need to support Ukraine, or you don't need to fight for Ukraine anymore. If they manage to achieve their success domestically in Ukraine, they undermine Ukrainian fourth generation efforts, which then has an impact on the battlefield. And if they manage to slow down or not permit the provision of certain equipment for Ukraine, again, that has impact on the battlefield, which then transformed into informational operation, which then transformed again into attempts to undermine the fourth generation or the supply of the Ukrainian military. So they try to play on all three of those pillars and try to use them in a way that reinforce each other.
Maybe my last question: what is in the light of all those things that we have discussed, and in the light of the first question about Russian strategy, what is your biggest concern? What should be we Ukrainians, Europeans, Americans, other people that are with Ukraine? What should we be the most concerned about? What is the biggest danger in the future?
Well, one of the most immediate danger is the threat that Ukraine will be forced to swap the territories without sufficient security guarantees, which, on the condition that Russia violated ceasefire for so many times with Ukraine, will essentially end up of giving Russia a significant share of the most fortified territories that Ukraine will have, only to end up fighting the war much closer to Ukrainian heartland on a much worse position than was before, and which much lower morale than it was before. That's definitely a risk there.
And I would add that collapse of Ukraine from within, I think it's also very, very big danger, and I think that this is what Russians really want through this war of attrition. Glib Voloskyi, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld, an English language media outlet about Ukraine, run by Internews Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld, and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today was Glib Voloskyi, analyst at the Initiative Center of Come Back Alive, Povernys zhyvym, one of Ukraine's most prominent charitable foundations. Let me remind you that you can support our work on Patreon. Your contributions are essential as we rely heavily on crowdfunding. You can also help our regular volunteer trips to frontline areas in Ukraine, where we support both civilians and soldiers. Donations here are welcomed via PayPal. You'll find all the relevant links in the episode description. Thank you for listening, stay with us, and stand with Ukraine.